wasn't looking for anything. Not connection, not change. But one quiet glance from a stranger in a dim cafe shifted something in me. Slowly, without a word, he began to unravel the silence I'd built my life around, and I couldn't look away. Julian Frost never believed in meaningful chance encounters. Life, in his view, was a chain of predictable outcomes strung together by rational choices. He had spent most of his adult years constructing barriers in the shape of routines, schedules, and neatly arranged silences. It had been enough, or so he thought, until the evening he met Asher Hale. It happened on a Tuesday, that nondescript hour when the city seemed to breathe out its exhaustion. Julian had stopped by a small, quiet cafe tucked between a hardware store and a dry cleaner. It wasn't his usual place. The light inside was dim and amber, with jazz murmuring from a speaker near the ceiling, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and worn pages. Asher was already there, seated by the window, fingers loosely wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. He was alone, eyes half closed, his expression unreadable but peaceful. Julian noticed him in the way you notice a single lamp still burning on a dark street. Not because it called attention to itself, but because it was the only one not pretending to be invisible. They didn't speak. Julian sat 2 tables away, opened his laptop, and tried to read something he couldn't focus on. His eyes kept drifting toward the man by the window. There was nothing overtly remarkable about him. Messy brown hair, a worn navy coat, a few days' worth of stubble. And yet something about his stillness tugged at Julian. It wasn't desire. Not yet. It was something subtler. Recognition, maybe, or memory. The moment stretched. Rain began to patter against the glass outside, soft and rhythmic. Julian watched it, then glanced at Asher again. Their eyes met. Not dramatically, just briefly, like 2 thoughts brushing past each other in the same crowded hallway. But it left Julian unsettled. He left without finishing his drink. Over the next week, Julian found himself returning to the same cafe at the same time. It became a quiet curiosity at first. Not obsession, not even interest, just the question of whether Asher would be there again. He was always alone, always silent, sometimes with a book, sometimes just with the same worn mug and a gaze fixed somewhere inward. On the 3rd evening, Asher nodded as Julian entered. Not a greeting, just acknowledgement. It startled Julian more than it should have. The nod meant he'd noticed too. Days passed, and the nod became a ritual. A small exchange between 2 men who hadn't spoken a word. Julian began to time his arrival more carefully, choosing clothes without understanding why, and spending longer than necessary ordering something he wouldn't drink. He had no reason to speak to Asher. No plan. Yet each evening, as he watched the quiet man absorb the hush of the room, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in him, the fragile outline of longing. It wasn't a crush, nor was it fantasy. It was weightless and precise, like dust suspended in a sunbeam, beautiful only because it existed without purpose. Julian began to notice the small details. The way Asher's thumb traced the rim of his cup. How his eyes lingered on raindrops as if they whispered something only he could hear. How his presence didn't fill space so much as fold into it, like a memory. He wondered what had made him that way. There was a sadness to Asher, not theatrical or dramatic, just settled, lived in. Julian, who had spent years avoiding emotional clutter, found himself drawn to it, not out of pity, but recognition. One evening, as Julian prepared to leave, he looked over and found Asher watching him. Not staring, just watching. Their eyes met again, and this time neither of them looked away immediately. There was no smile, no nod, only a quiet understanding passing between them like a ripple across still water. Julian walked home that night slower than usual, replaying that look in his mind. Something had shifted. Nothing had happened, but still, something had. He told himself it was nothing. A coincidence. A mirror of loneliness in someone else. But that night, as he lay in bed, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, Julian realized he was waiting for tomorrow in a way he hadn't waited for anything in years. He didn't even know his name. And yet he already felt that this man, this stranger, was about to rearrange the silence inside him. The next few days unfolded like a soft unraveling. Julian returned to the cafe, not because he needed coffee, but because something in him sought presence. Not noise, not attention, just nearness. Asher was there, always by the same window, his silhouette framed by fading afternoon light. They hadn't exchanged more than a look, and yet each silent evening deepened the rhythm between them. It was as though the quiet had become its own language, subtle, precise, and full of things that didn't need to be said. Julian had never believed in shared solitude. He thought being alone meant disconnection. But with Asher across the room, loneliness felt gentler, not because it was gone, but because it was now witnessed. There was a strange intimacy in knowing someone else existed within the same hush. Their eyes would meet, sometimes for only a second. No smile, no movement, just acknowledgement. And yet, in those glances, Julian began to feel something both terrifying and tender. The beginning of a bond that asked for nothing but gave more than he expected. He started to notice how Asher moved, how he cradled the mug with both hands, even when it wasn't cold, how his brow furrowed slightly when he was deep in thought, how his fingers tapped the table in subtle rhythm, like counting time in a song only he could hear. Julian tried to focus on his reading, but his attention strayed. It wasn't distraction, it was gravity. Asher's presence pulled at something inside him, something he'd buried under years of control and detachment. There was a moment, just a flicker in time, when Asher adjusted his seat and their shoulders briefly aligned. No contact, not even a brush, but the proximity sent a quiet shiver through Julian's spine. It startled him, not because of the sensation, but because of how much he wanted it to last just a second longer. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was projecting, but he couldn't deny the way the air felt different when Asher was near. Thicker, charged, as though even the light between them knew to hold its breath. On one particular evening, the sky outside was a pale wash of gray, the kind that threatened rain but never followed through. Julian arrived earlier than usual and took a seat slightly closer to Asher's. Not directly beside him. That would be too much. Just near enough to feel the edges of his presence more clearly. Asher noticed but didn't react. He glanced over once, a slow turn of the head, eyes meeting Julian's with the same steady calm. And that was all. No words. No gesture. Just that gaze. Not invasive, not curious, but open, like an unlocked door that made no demand to be entered. Julian stayed longer than usual that night. He didn't pretend to read. He simply sat there, absorbing the silence, letting it wrap around him like a coat he hadn't known he missed. Occasionally, their eyes would meet again, small flickers in the stillness, sparks that left no smoke but warmed the air between them. When Asher stood to leave, he paused for a moment beside Julian's table. Not too close, not long, just enough to say something without saying anything. His eyes searched Julian's for a beat longer than necessary. And then he walked out, the bell above the door jingling once, then fading. Julian didn't move for several minutes. He sat motionless, surrounded by half-empty cups and the low hum of closing hours. Inside him, something was stirring, not a storm, but a shift. A quiet realization that his world, once perfectly controlled, had tilted just slightly. Enough to notice, enough to care. That night, in his apartment, Julian stood by the window, watching the city breathe. He thought of Asher, of the way silence seemed to settle differently when he was around. It wasn't absence. It was presence, distilled and unspoken. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, not knowing felt like permission to feel. The next morning, he found himself looking at the clock earlier than usual. He didn't plan to go to the cafe, but he also didn't plan not to. His day moved with a strange anticipation, like something unnamed was waiting just outside his usual path. And when the evening came, and the light began to dim once again, Julian knew exactly where he would be. Not for coffee, not for answers, but for the space between two chairs, for the silence that now belonged to both of them. The cafe had become more than just a routine now. It was a place suspended from the rest of Julian's life, a quiet bubble where the noise of the world softened and something unspoken came to breathe. Every time he opened the door and saw Asher already there, something in his chest eased, like a knot he didn't realize he carried was loosening. That night, Asher looked different. Not physically, the same jacket slung over the back of his chair, the same posture relaxed but guarded, but in his eyes, there was a heaviness to them, a quiet storm. Julian sat down nearby, not asking questions. Their shared space didn't require them. The silence between them had grown so familiar it now carried its own meanings. Still, something was different tonight. The air had changed. There was weight in the stillness. Asher didn't touch his drink. He stared at the condensation gathering on the outside of the glass, like it was the only thing anchoring him to the present. Julian, sensing something fragile beneath the surface, waited, not pressing, but present. Fully there. Minutes passed like ripples. No movement, no sound. Then, slowly, Asher turned his head, not to look directly at Julian, but just enough for his profile to shift in the fading light. And then, without words, it began. There was no story. Not exactly. No neatly recounted memory. No clear confession. Just fragments, pieces of something broken long ago, offered not as explanation, but as release. A lost relationship, buried years ago in a different city with different rules. Someone he had loved too openly, perhaps too fiercely. A fallout that left more than silence in its wake. It left fear. Fear of being seen. Fear trying again. Fear of that first spark becoming fire. Asher's hands remained still, but his breathing shifted. Subtle, uneven, like someone learning how to speak without making sound. Julian listened, not just to what wasn't being said, but to the way the light caught on the edge of Asher's expression, to the way his jaw tightened and then relaxed again. He didn't react. He didn't need to. Asher wasn't telling the story to receive comfort. He was letting it fall into the space between them because somehow he knew it would land softly there. Julian felt it all, not just the content of the story, but the way it was delivered, with restraint, with dignity, and with a kind of ache that didn't beg to be soothed, only understood. He thought about his own walls, the carefully maintained distance he kept from anything uncertain. He had always told himself he was just private, just focused, but maybe, like Asher, he had been hiding too. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something rawer, the first recognition that someone else might carry the same scars, even if they wore them differently. The cafe began to empty. Chairs scraped softly across the floor, and the outside world bled in through the windows in streaks of orange and blue. Still, neither of them moved. There was no need. Julian let his gaze fall to Asher's hands. Hands that had built a life, lost it, and still knew how to hold stillness like a precious thing. And for the first time since they had met, Julian wanted to reach across the space between them. Not to touch, just to close the distance with something more than presence. But he didn't. Instead, he let the moment stay intact, untouched, because some silences were sacred. When Asher finally stood to leave, he paused again. This time, there was a different kind of look, not just acknowledgement, but trust. Vulnerable, quiet trust. Julian didn't speak, but his eyes said what he couldn't. I'm here. I heard you, and I haven't turned away. That night, Julian sat on his balcony long after the lights in his apartment went dark. The city murmured around him, but his mind was elsewhere. Not just with Asher's story, but with the space it had opened up inside his own silence. Something had shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named, but deeply, quietly. What lingered between them now was no longer curiosity. It was knowing. And once that kind of knowing begins, it's hard to let it go. It had started like most evenings, with familiarity, with routine. But tonight, something in the air buzzed just beneath the surface. A subtle urgency in the quiet. A shift in rhythm. Julian arrived at the cafe later than usual. He had told himself he wasn't going to go. That maybe the spell between them needed to break before it twisted into something unspeakable. But resistance, as it turned out, had a very specific shape, and that shape looked a lot like Asher Hale sitting alone by the window, head tilted, as if he'd been waiting. There were no words, just a long glance as Julian entered, and a nod that held something heavier than it had before. Julian felt it before he sat down, the weight of something approaching. Not danger, but something that demanded attention. The hours folded in on themselves. A few others came and went, chairs shifted, mugs clinked against wood, the barista wiped down surfaces like clockwork. But none of it mattered. When the cafe began to close, Asher didn't move. Julian, too, lingered. And then it happened, without plan, without pretense. Asher stood and glanced toward the exit, his coat in hand, but paused just slightly, as if waiting for Julian to follow. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even a gesture. It was a pause long enough to be a question. Julian rose. The street outside was quiet, brushed in silver from the street lamps, shadows stretching long across the sidewalks. They walked without speaking, not side by side, but not apart either, two men moving through the night with a thread of silence tying them together. Julian didn't ask where they were going. He didn't need to. The streets felt less like a destination and more like a container for whatever had been building between them. Eventually, Asher turned down a narrow side road, one Julian had never noticed before. It led to a small public park, a forgotten space nestled between apartment buildings. There were no children, no benches, no signs. Just grass, a few trees, and the heavy stillness of night. They stopped there, beneath the dim glow of a single streetlight. The city hummed in the distance, but here, it was only them. For a moment, neither moved. Julian's heart pounded, though nothing had happened. The silence, once familiar, now felt dangerous in a different way. Not because of fear, but because of what it made room for. Asher exhaled slowly. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deep. A sound of something letting go. His eyes met Julian's, and in them was something raw. Not longing, not desire. Need. The kind that lives in quiet people, the kind that never asks out loud. Julian took a step forward. Only one. Just enough to close the invisible gap between them. The proximity made the air feel heavier, tighter. There was no touch, no words. Just the shape of breath between two men who had spent weeks circling something they couldn't name. Asher looked away first, not in retreat, but in surrender, like the weight of being seen had become too much. Julian watched the subtle shift in his shoulders, the way his chest rose and fell, unsteady now. And without thinking, Julian reached up, not to touch, not to grab, but to offer. A gesture, suspended midair, fingers outstretched but not yet making contact. The space between them pulsed with tension. Asher didn't move away. The air held still. Julian lowered his hand slowly, letting it fall between them again. The gesture had spoken enough, and somehow, the lack of contact was more intimate than if they had touched. It had become a choice, a line drawn, not from fear, but from understanding. They stood like that for what felt like hours, two men in their 30s, shaped by loss and silence, facing something that neither of them had planned. What connected them wasn't physical. Not yet. It was something deeper, a current of emotion, of trust, of shared vulnerability. Julian's mind wasn't racing. For once, there were no questions, just presence, just the overwhelming clarity that this moment mattered. Asher met his gaze again. Something unspoken passed between them, a permission, a promise, or maybe just acknowledgement that whatever this was, it was real. They didn't need more tonight. When they parted, it was with the gentlest look. Not goodbye. Not yet. Julian walked home in silence, but inside, everything was louder. He didn't know where this path would lead. He only knew that a line had been crossed. Not in action, but in meaning. The connection between them had transformed. From quiet observation to something deeper. Something alive. And now, there was no turning away from it. The following days unfolded like echoes, soft, steady, and reverberating with everything that had not been said beneath the streetlight. Julian found himself moving through his routines with a kind of calm he didn't recognize. The world around him hadn't changed. The city still pulsed, traffic still groaned beneath the morning sky, strangers still passed without eye contact. But something in him had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but unmistakably. He still returned to the cafe. It was no longer a question of chance or habit. It was a quiet thread of continuity, something grounding. Asher was there most evenings, though not always. When he wasn't, Julian didn't panic. He didn't doubt. The absence didn't erase what had happened. It only made space for something larger than presence. When Asher did appear, their meetings were as quiet as ever. But now, the silence between them was warmer. Full. They didn't sit as far apart. Their chairs angled slightly, shoulders nearly aligned. They exchanged glances that didn't need translation. There was a softness in the way they occupied space, not claiming it but offering it. Julian no longer looked for signs or meaning in every movement. He stopped overthinking whether this connection had a name. What mattered now wasn't defining it. It was living inside of it, accepting that some bonds weren't born from declarations or sudden sparks, but from the patient accumulation of shared stillness. One evening, rain returned to the city, heavy and steady, falling in thick curtains across the pavement. The cafe buzzed with muted activity, umbrellas stacked by the door, windows fogging with breath and warmth. Asher arrived, soaked through, hair dripping beneath the hood of his coat. Julian saw him before the door, even closed behind him. Without a word, he gestured to the chair beside him. Not across the room, not near the window, but next to his own. For the first time, Asher accepted. They sat like that for a long time, shoulders brushing occasionally as they moved, not deliberately, but without hesitation. The contact was small, incidental, but it held a kind of truth no words could have carried. Julian didn't need to ask questions about the past. He had heard what mattered. Asher didn't need reassurance about the future. The present, in all its quiet, was enough. Later, they stepped out into the rain together. No umbrellas, no rush, just slow steps through a city that blurred into soft light and reflections. Asher tilted his face upward, letting the rain soak his skin. Julian watched him for a moment, then did the same. There was something freeing in it, letting the rain wash over them, unhidden, unguarded. They ended up back at Julian's apartment. Not as an invitation, not as a threshold, just two people not ready to separate yet. They didn't touch. They didn't talk. Julian made tea. Asher dried his hair with a towel. They sat on the couch, not too close, but not apart either, watching the steam rise from their mugs. Outside, the storm continued, wrapping the world in a veil of gray. In that room, silence bloomed like something sacred. There were moments where Julian wanted to reach across the distance and take Asher's hand. But he didn't. Not because of fear, not because of uncertainty, but because sometimes the deepest closeness is built through restraint, through respect, through the choice not to rush what is still unfolding. Time passed without urgency. They watched the rain, and when Asher stood to leave, Julian didn't stop him. There was no need. They exchanged a look at the door. Not goodbye. Not yet. Just a shared breath that said, "This matters. You matter." Julian remained by the window long after the door clicked shut. His reflection merged with the wet glass, city lights dancing across his features like memory. He didn't know what would come next, whether this was a beginning or an echo of something already complete. But he felt peace, a rare, grounded kind, because whatever this connection was, it had changed him, made him more awake, more open. Some stories don't need grand endings. They simply shift the way a person sees the world. And sometimes that's enough.